So in the demo I just did, I used two specific events to handle the beginning and end of each request. The first was begin request and the second was end request. And on the slide you can see there's a whole bunch of other events that take place between those two that you might find useful. And what I've done on the slide is listed all the events in sequence as they're issued for each request that is processed in the pipeline. So begin request and end request are probably the most common because they surround the entire request process. But there's some other useful ones. Authenticate request. This is useful because by the time this event is issued, the identity of the user has been established. So if the user is being authenticated with Windows authentication or forms-based authentication, this event will be fired after that authentication has taken place. User authorization is another event that is triggered right after that. So once you've identified what access a particular user has, that'll be ready to go by the time you get to that event. There's a cache event. Again, not used too often, but it's used by caching modules to bypass execution of handlers if they decide they want to draw from the cache instead. That's used specifically by the output cache mechanism in ASP.NET. Acquire request state is used to load session states. You can see when each thing is occurring as you go through this life cycle. Pre-request handler execute. This one is actually quite useful. I found it quite useful lately. What this does when this is called is just before the request is dispatched to the endpoint. So imagine you've got a page class, foo.aspx, and before it actually invokes process request on that page, it will fire this event, which gives you an opportunity to potentially manipulate the endpoint if you want to. You could add handlers to it, etc. In fact, we'll do an example of that in another module. But just keep in mind that's sort of your last event, the last event you can access before your page is going to be dispatched onto. And then there's a follow-up event, the post-request handler execute. You can use that to do something after the page has actually processed the request and maybe manipulate the response or something. Release request state, so that's going to release session state back. It's going to flush state out to servers if you have that configured. And then update request cache, again, that's used primarily by the output caching mechanism. There are some other events that are issued not with every request, but under certain conditions. So for example, disposed is going to be fired just before the application is shut down in most cases. Error is a global event that can be handled, that is going to be fired whenever an unhandled exception propagates to the top level of your application. That's quite useful to know about. And then there's pre-request, send request content and pre-send request headers. So all these events can be used to intercept various points in the lifecycle. Again, the ones that I tend to use the most often are certainly begin and end. Authenticate, if you're doing anything with security, is often useful to use, and then pre-request handler execute you might find useful as well. So keep those in mind. There are some other events that are available in the application class that are not specifically defined as events per se, but these are functions that are going to be called at certain points in time in the life cycle of the application. And several of these are sort of carryovers from classic ASP. The application start event and end event. So these are called when the application first starts and when it completes, and then similarly session start and session end. And what people have traditionally used these events for is for populating data structures that they want to use either across the entire application or within a particular session state object for a given user. And you can still use them for that purpose. The only way to add handlers for these events is to write a function that is named exactly one of these four names with the right signature and place it in your global ASAX file.